we have right at the time of the revolution, which was right around 1917. This is a revolution that occurred because during the time of the czars were so very wealthy. The czars owned the land, and everybody else was pretty much a peasant or a serf that worked the lands. And so this revolution was very bloody. The czar at the time, I believe it was Nicholas II, and him and his family were slaughtered. There's a lot of really dramatic and terrible history about that. So this People's Revolution, the underlying idea was more fairness. And so people could own some of the property that had been owned by the czars. Now this wasn't, and then all these ethnicities, we need to think about this too. All these ethnicities that are here now, because as it expanded from this little place, the Duchess of Muscovy, as it was known back then, all the way out during that time frame of the czars. And all these ethnicities, which were to become republics under the Soviet Union, were promised a lot of things at that time. They were promised some autonomy, they were promised fairness, and we will talk later about what happened. What happened during Soviet times. Now, there were a lot of really positive things that happened during the Soviet time frame. And then there were many negative things that happened because it fell apart. So some of the really positive things, and again, this is Soviet times begin, we'll say around 1917. And the collapse of the Soviet Union was 1991, which is not a lot of time. That's less than 100 years of Russian history. So I hope you can see from this that first the Slavs, the history of the Slavs, that was hundreds of years. The time of the czars was centuries. And then the time of the Soviet Union was less than 100 years. So that is a lot less time, but it was huge as far as changing everything for Russia. So Soviet time period was due to the people wanting fairness and being promised some fairness. And so the people were to run their own government. And we're going to talk a lot more about that next time. But I hope you can just see the very difference in time frames right now, and that the land expansion just, oh, and one other thing I'd like to add about the land expansion. Under the czars, Peter the Great, and then especially under Catherine, how would they get this land expansion to occur? There were already people living in these areas, and again, a lot of them are very cold, so it's very sparse in those areas. But they had hired horsemen, Cossacks, to actually ride through these territories. And so they would send them out, and especially along this route here at the southern border of Russia now, there's those routes where the Cossacks would go, and they would actually take their horses and pack them up. And if you didn't have some kind of a way station that had some shelter, some food, then you just couldn't live. It's just so brutally cold in a lot of these places. But they would literally show up and put a station up there and say to the people that live there, you are now in Russia. So, yeah, that would be really something. They were actually, and the interesting thing too, you can just imagine a lot of people when they think of Russia and they think of Slavic people, they don't think of a lot of minorities because it's just something that we don't hear about. But really when you look at the ethnicity map, there really are so many ethnic minorities living within the borders just because during that time of expansion, these lands were just taken over just suddenly taken over. And 1 minute, I guess they were just living, out in a rural place, and then the next minute they're living in a place called Russia. And that was during the time of the Tsars. So, and the Soviet Union, it just stayed, the borders just stayed there. And of course, the ethnic minorities, they were at a position to where they kind of wanted to get out of it at that point, because now there was a new game in town, and all of a sudden now it was turning communist, and so these places really had to sign treaties to be part of the Soviet Union. So we'll talk about that later. Some of them, as you can imagine, didn't like that very much. So they were not happy when they were offered the pen. So we'll talk about that next time.